So this is a conversation with Musa Okwonga. He's a Berlin-based British writer, poet, broadcaster, and musician who also co-hosts the popular football podcast Stadio. Musa also frequently writes for the Byline Times and for The Guardian, among others, about some of the topics that we'll be discussing today. Musa was actually a guest of my previous podcast, Hummus For Thought, and I wanted to have him on here to hear his reflections of these past several weeks now on the social distancing. We spoke about his experience growing up black in the UK, his move to Germany, and how both countries have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also spoke about the treatment of refugees trying to reach Fortress Europe's borders, how the world fades Syria, and about the importance of acknowledging how widespread the dehumanization of racialized groups of people has become. As usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FireTheseTimes and on Instagram at TheFireTheseTimes. And you can also support it on Patreon or on buymeacoffee.com, the links to which are in the description. Thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Musa Okwonga. I'm a writer, broadcaster, and very occasional musician, and I'm based in Berlin.
Awesome, Musa. Thanks for having this conversation with me. As of now, you're the first person to do the both podcasts, this one and the one I had before, Hummus For Thought.
I'm honoured.
I'll send you some kind of plaque later or something.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, so let's start with your general reflections. You've written a lot and reflected a lot and shared a lot of, the situation, let's call it lightly, the pandemic, obviously the COVID-19 crisis, how many people have been reacting to it, especially racialized people in different countries. In your case, you can speak a bit to the German context, to the UK context, of course, and so on. So I would be very curious if you can discuss a bit the recent pieces you've written and other reflections that you may have, on kind of this comparison a bit between how you've seen the crisis being handled where you live in Germany and how it's being handled in the UK.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because in Germany, you have Angela Merkel, who has been criticized for many things over the last few years. Sometimes unfairly, sometimes not. But generally speaking, Merkel is someone who, as a friend of mine said memorably, leads invisibly. He said, it's funny, Merkel's been in charge of this country for years, but you never see her. He said, it's so interesting. She's kind of this invisible presence where things are kind of running smoothly and it's really not about putting her face on the front of everything. And we can contrast that with the UK experience where we have publications like The Economist and The Telegraph saying that Boris Johnson is almost synonymous with the nation, which is a kind of these are rumblings of dangerous ancient ideologies. We don't have to name them because if we name them, we might always bring them into being. But, the contrast there of Merkel being an invisible leader of a relatively successful, well-run nation and Boris Johnson being the omnipresent leader whose health is identified with the health of the nation, as recently in a piece by Alison Pearce in The Telegraph. You see already a contrast in leadership styles. Now, the importance of Merkel's leadership style in relation to the handling of COVID-19 is that when Merkel speaks, everyone listens. So when she addressed the nation about COVID-19, everyone was like, to pardon my Spanish, SHIT got real. It got real. And so at that point when Merkel said it, everyone was like, the adults have spoken. The adults have entered the room. Whereas Boris Johnson and his leadership have been characterized by evasion, lies and illegality, and omnipresent lies and illegality. And so when the country was primed to face a genuine threat, not a threat that could be expanded and contracted according to the whims of what the Poles wanted, because you can't, unlike refugees or immigrants, expand and contract the threat as politically convenient, then you saw the difference. Because Merkel saw the arrival of a genuine problem and dealt with it accordingly. And so here's the thing. One thing I would say with the contrast of styles is no one is expecting no one to die from this. Everyone is expecting a difficult problem to be handled competently. And if we look at the handling of COVID-19 in Germany and the respect people have for Merkel, it's just flown up. I think some approval polls are at 90%. I'm seeing polls of approval 80 to 90%. I don't want to get too caught up in the cult of personality, but I thought I would just start there in terms of presentation and competence.
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely have my fair share of criticism of Angela Merkel, but this, as far as I can tell anyway, this would definitely not be one of them. The fact that she has a scientific background, no doubt, also helps her in that favor as well. But so, okay, thanks for that. That kind of sets the scene a bit. Obviously, we're dealing with a situation that all of us, most of us, did not really think would happen. Obviously, none of us could really have predicted the way it happened, the pandemic, the way it happened so far. And it has forced quite a lot of us to, rethink things, slow down. Some people have even, dare I say it, said that this has been good for them. I don't want to get too much into the good versus bad thing. As I mentioned and before we started this, like it would be insensitive to those who cannot work from home, to those who are just cut off in much worse situation than the situation I'm currently in. Which, despite everything else, at least I can say that I feel safe, I feel comfortable. For the foreseeable future, at least, I feel like things are okay. How have you been experiencing this, like on a more personal level? As I mentioned in the beginning, you've definitely been doing a lot, as I've been seeing, from the podcast to a bit of music here and there, from what I can tell. How has your personal experience of this whole pandemic been so far?
Again, like yourself, I'm hesitant to complain because I have a roof over my head. I can afford to cook. I can cook. Look, I've been fundamentally pretty good. I got hit pretty hard. In freelance terms, a major contract that I was working on has not been renewed as a direct result of this. So that's cost me, I think, over €2,000 a month. And I've also lost substantial speaking engagements in the future. So that's another sort of few thousand, I would say. So I've lost quite heavily financially, and I'm down to the bare bones, I would say, at this point in terms of cash flow. But at the same time, in comparison to others, I have my health, and I have support networks. In terms of how it's been personally, I've tried to take the opportunity I have and the platform I have to reflect and to spread and begin conversations that I think are useful at this time. I feel like we're at the Occupy moment right now, in a way that, we had Occupy movement after the financial crash. I believe we have another moment like that now, where there's a period of brief chaos or uncertainty, and into that chaos, into that vacuum, we can insert good ideas for positive, progressive ways forward, perhaps a better social settlement. So that's been my agenda at the moment. But in terms of how I've taken it personally, I would say, yeah, it has been difficult. Like I say, again, I'm vastly luckier than so many people. At the same, the hardest thing has been the isolation, I think. The isolation of, I haven't seen some of my best friends for 7 weeks. Mm-hmm. And the discipline to say, even though people are around the corner, to say, look, I'm not hanging out with you because we're personally healthy, we're fine, but we may spread this to people who don't have good immune systems. So I've got friends, for example, who live 10 minutes away who I haven't seen because they cannot afford with their immune systems to leave the flat. So yeah, personally fine, but difficult in a broader context.
Yeah, that checks through with me as well. I lost my grandfather about, I don't even know how many time has just been frozen for me. It's been a month and a half, I think now, something like that.
Oh dear, I'm very sorry.
Thank you. He was already sick before, so it wasn't related to COVID-19 as far as we know. But I mean, that was in Lebanon, obviously. So I obviously couldn't go back. Even if I could, the flights were not, the airports were not closed yet back then. But I obviously was not even considering it. It's not something that I would do. Yeah. But yeah, it has, like, the way I would describe the past, couple of months almost now. Mental health, working on it. Sometimes you have ups and downs. Seeing a therapist, Zoom therapy now, helps, obviously. But yeah, again, I guess the description that you've which is made of yourself is the same. In the broader context, I can definitely see a lot of obstacles ahead. By no means is even the rest of the year I feel secured in that sense, financially or otherwise. But I can at least say that the support networks are there. There's family. I have family here in Switzerland, where I currently live. My partner, I live with her as well. So there are, more things than I would have had otherwise. Let's put it that way. And I feel like that in itself has been really, really highlighted with this pandemic. So in some ways, I guess this segues a bit awkwardly to the notion of being grateful. Like it's something that for me is a very bitter topic, as it is for you as well. And here, we'll talk about the whole concept of being a quote-unquote good immigrant in an ungrateful country, which goes back to you being from the UK and so on. Gratefulness for me is something that I feel if I have the choice in the matter, so if it's something that it's not being imposed, then it can be it is a good thing, of course. If I'm grateful for, as I said, where I live, for these networks and so on, for the fact that things aren't worse. That's one way of being grateful. Another way, which is the way you speak about in your chapter in the book, The Good Immigrant, which I will link to in the description as well, is that you have to be grateful. That's the notion, that's the idea that many people, if not most people of quote-unquote immigrant background in the UK, and I put a quote unquote because, as I think it was Afua Hirsch, I think you shared her article recently, who mentioned how white migration is not really considered migration.
Yeah.
From South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So
right.
I wonder if you can talk a bit about how how it felt to re-release this essay recently. Which when was it written?
2016.
2016. Important year in UK history. I wonder what it was like to re-release this essay and to sort of see the contrast between now and 2016 of how this quote-unquote ungrateful country and the good immigrant, these two categories, let's say, how have they been reflected in light of you being in Berlin as one thing, being in Germany as one thing, and in light of the pandemic as well.
What's been really interesting, and thanks for bringing that question into play, that essay into play. What's been really interesting since writing that essay is I feel completely vindicated in my decision to move to Germany. And that's not to say that Germany doesn't have profound problems. It does. I mean, the Germans, the violent far right in Germany is frightening because it's very well organized and it's very large and it's influential. It's got a reach and it's well armed. So that is frightening. At the same time, I would say the benefits of living in Germany, and I mean the social benefits, not the financial ones. I mean the people, the kind of people you meet here, the activists, the academics, and the community people, the people in the community. Like, there's a strength and a bond here and a beauty to the best people in Germany that I've really gained from. That's really been amazing. And I think it's allowed me to move away from the concept of gratitude to one which is much healthier, which is that whichever country I live in or end up in, I will always contribute something by trying to be a compassionate member of that society. It's much healthier than a sense of, oh, I'm just happy for whatever comes from the table, which is what happens in the UK. And the UK is quite insidious because you can make a career there as a black person, as someone with a heritage from a non-white country. Let's be honest, it's not about a heritage from a white country, it's a heritage from a non-white country. As someone with that heritage in the UK, you can make a living for yourself, but within certain parameters. So there are just things that if you are outspoken about certain things, you won't get certain jobs. If you speak out, like Afwa's done really well, but even Afwa is on like a TV show where she's basically a minority the whole time, like in terms of numerically and ideologically. When Afwa does a lot of those talk shows, it's normally like 4 or 5 people that disagree with her completely, and she's the only progressive person in the room, the only person of colour in the room. So the UK is really good at rationing access to power. Germany also rations access to power, but the luck that I have is that because my work is international in scope and I draw my money from multiple sources, I'm kind of a free agent in Germany. And to tie it back to a wider context of being a grateful migrant, I think that I really feel for black people in Germany, those who are born here and those who come here as working class Africans, because I feel as if my privilege is a shield here. The fact that I have a private school education, the fact that I have a British accent, it insulates me from the worst ravages of German society in relation to racism, because the moment I open my mouth or people see my credentials, I'm somehow exempt. And I think there is a bit of a pressure. I think one reason I'm a bit wary of praising Germany too much in terms of its handling of the current crisis is that praise, if it becomes excessive, almost shields the really grave and profound problems that refugees have here, that black people have here, that people of non-white heritage have here. Because, look, it was only a couple of years ago we were referring to the arrival of refugees here as a crisis of refugees, of people, whereas it was actually a humanitarian crisis. It was the product of a war crime, and maybe we should have called it that. We should have said, actually, this is this arrival of so many human beings is the result of a war crime. If we'd called it actually the war crime of 2015, or, the Assad exodus, if we put Assad's name front and center in that, we wouldn't be here now. So I don't know. I've got, in relation to being grateful, I no longer feel grateful to be in Germany. I'm thankful that I'm here and not in the UK, which is a helpful difference. And I'm also trying to use my platform to say, actually, no, Germany may have handled this well on an overall level, but a disproportionate number of people dying of this, certainly in the UK, are black and of minority ethnic backgrounds. We can't forget that. And a disproportionate number of people suffering within Germany at the moment because of its economic policies towards working class people are black, are Africans, are refugees, are dark skinned. And I want to just make that point as well.
It's a bit I don't know if funny is the word, but definitely interesting. Like you what you just said kind of just made me think of James Baldwin when he moved to Paris as a young, I think he was in his early 20s or something. And at some point, when he was reflecting on this, he basically said that he was asked, "Don't worry, here in Paris, we're not racists against black people." And he basically responded something along the lines, "Well, that's because your N-word is the Algerian," and he was making that point, and that's someone that's something that colored his life quite a lot. I don't know if you have gotten into it, but I would recommend reading about his life in France, actually.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
I'll just put it in the show notes for everyone else to read it as well. But yeah, he lived not too far from where I am now. Something like, I don't know, Saint-Paul-de-Vence it's called. And that's where he passed away. He spent the last decade or so of his life also there mostly. And he was able to find some kind of, let's call it, balance, because he always understood that he was living in a racist country as well. Yeah. But he was just, I guess, painfully aware that his foreignness, like his Americanness, kind of gave him some kind of cover. Because he was a different kind of black in the way he was, the way he phrased it. So I bring him as also another kind of awkward segue because I wrote a piece on Byline Times in which I started it by quoting him, by quoting Baldwin, which I tend to do quite a lot. And the piece in general is about, the title, I have it in front of me, is like Why Fortress Europe and the European Union Cannot Coexist.
Right.
You mentioned how it was called the refugee crisis, and it's incredible to me that this already feels like a decade ago, whereas it's like it was still being called that 5 seconds before the pandemic really hit home in Europe.
Right.
And here I'm referring obviously to the violence at the border, which was early March. It's insane to actually think about it this way, but it was early March.
Yeah.
2nd of March actually. And the response of the EU was to basically say, what was it? Ursula von der Leyen said that, Greece is our shield, aspida in
Yeah.
Greek.
Unbelievable.
And
yeah.
it says a lot, and I made the Economist put rightly in this case compared her reaction to Orban's reaction 5 years ago when Orban was being called all sorts of titles, all sorts of names, and justifiably so.
Yeah.
But his narrative, or the narrative of that worldview, let's say, has won. At least has definitely won a battle. Let's say maybe it hasn't won the war, so to speak, but it's definitely made some advances.
Yes.
And I'm also in a curious comparison is that I'm now in Switzerland for my studies. I'm also thankful for being here and not being in the UK, although I miss it as well.
Yeah.
Simply because it's already pretty difficult to be a student immigrant. That I really did not want to have other stuff to also have to think about, which unfortunately some of my Lebanese friends and other Arab friends and Middle Eastern friends who are in the UK or especially in America, unfortunately now, are really having to deal with. And there are lots of horrible stuff that are going to come out of this, that's for sure. So again, as I said, it's a very awkward segue, but I'm curious as to how you've seen the naming, the politics of naming, when we talk about a refugee crisis, which is, in my opinion, and I'm sure you would agree, more like it was a European crisis. It was a European identity crisis, a European politics crisis. The crisis was from within. It's rarely from without. And now it's kind of been buried. So I wrote this, started writing this when the events were happening, the horrible stuff of like the boats shooting at people and that kind of stuff that we saw at the border between Turkey and Greece. But it took me a while to actually publish it. A month later, it was published, so early April this month. And it was difficult for me while writing it to sort of make the point that, guys, like you need to pay attention to this because it's gonna come back. Like now it's on pause. It's frozen, and refugees are also having to just wait basically right now. Their lives are also on pause, and they are in much more vulnerable positions, obviously, than many of us, if not most of us. But it's gonna come back. Like the problem is still there. Everything is still there. Nothing has changed. If anything, things have gotten just worse. And it just feels to me that we are having this waiting game where the EU is just, trying to cover its own borders. And even within that, there's a lot of tension of how it's doing it, if it's doing it properly or not. That's a different discussion. But this whole notion that they are trying to be both a union that prioritizes or supposedly values open borders, that's supposed to be part of the EU anyway, within its borders obviously, while at the same time being so aggressively pro-borders, which I would just describe as anti-movement essentially. How has this tension, contradiction, all of these things, how does this let me just say, like, what are your thoughts on this?
No. Firstly, your segues are great. Actually, I haven't. these are great segues. Secondly, that piece was excellent in the Byline Times that you wrote. It was an excellent piece, and I really like the rigor with which you framed this issue. So first of all, like great segue, and I loved your article. I loved your essay, and I genuinely mean that. And the politics of naming, it's funny because COVID-19 crisis, it hasn't really been called that. It hasn't. We can call it that, but it hasn't been called a crisis. And I think the use of the word crisis is very interesting. It's interesting who gets to be the subject of a crisis or what gets to be the subject of a crisis. It's funny that a genuine threat to the European way of life, in quotes, such as the COVID-19 crisis, but the pandemic, doesn't get called that. But a threat, so to speak, which is not genuine, the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees whom the continent can actually absorb economically fairly easily. It's funny how that, and I think the reason it was called a crisis is because it calls out a lot of people. When refugees started arriving from, via the Mediterranean from several countries, primarily Syria, it forced European governments to create accommodation, and then the locals were like, wait a minute, where did this money come from? He said there was none. And all of a sudden, wealthy, complacent politicians were having to say, yeah, we've actually been screwing you for centuries. So instead of like saying that, they were like, oh no, it's actually refugees' fault. Yes, of course. And they allowed these narratives to perpetuate about refugees coming in and taking everything, because if they tell the truth, which is that there is money to provide accommodation and transport and healthcare for everyone and opportunities, then that becomes uncomfortable for them. So of course, refugees become weaponized. And it's interesting because von der Leyen is quite a conservative figure and quite a dangerous figure. The fact that she set up a department, a division called Protecting the European Way of Life within the EU, which was then hastily renamed, but the damage was done. The damage was done. And it became clear that, you know, the question was this, and this is Amos Cezaire's discourse on colonialism, where he talks about this same thing, about Europe having a real existential problem. And this is a long, long time ago. And he's talking about a lot of the same academics and individuals that are popping up now. The thing is, what is Europe? Is it defined primarily by what it is or what it is not? And I think, unfortunately, it's defined primarily by what it is not. And that's what Fortress Europe is about. That's why you've got the Voice of Europe Twitter account. Every single time someone with a non-white heritage background sexual assaults attacks someone violently, that is like a lead story for them. But you don't hear about the dude that drove all the way to Frankfurt, an hour from the suburbs, and slashed his girlfriend to death. You don't hear that story because he was white. You don't hear that story about how he'd been, oh, he was a lovely, nice guy, but then he went and stabbed his girlfriend to death. You don't hear that story. But every single time a non-white person commits a crime like that, it gets covered, as it should, because it's an outrage that women are being murdered, generated crimes. But it's interesting what we choose to suppress when we're talking about white Europeans and what we talk about when non-white, non-Europeans are involved. And my argument is this. My argument is actually every crime committed should get the fanfare that a crime by a non-white, non-European gets, because a decent society is outraged by the loss of life, no matter who's doing the loss of life. And there's a constant thing in Germany, in Europe, of painting people like myself, like yourself, non-white, heritage backgrounds, as somehow less than human, somehow less than worthy of empathy. And a really striking thing was the mass murder, the terrorist mass murder by white supremacists in Hanau in Germany, a town quite near Frankfurt, shortly before the pandemic broke out across Europe, where 11 people died, I think 9 people in kebab in a shisha place, and 9 people were murdered in a shisha place. The mother was murdered, and then the white supremacist turned a gun on himself. And the German police concluded this actually wasn't rooted in racism. Oh, he was alone. He was a lone wolf. A lone wolf. He was mentally ill. Yes, and among other things, in his dossier, his manifesto, he named a lot of these conspiracy theories, a lot of these tracks. There's a real denialism, unfortunately, in Europe about just how deep the hatred goes. And the reason the denial is so deep, I think, is not because a lot of people, well, a lot of them have that hate in themselves. A lot of them, firstly, are afraid to confront that within themselves, but even more are afraid to confront that hatred in their barber, in the person that runs the post office, in that relative at the dinner table whose opinions you find racist, but you never actually call out on. And that's the thing. I think in Europe, the racist rot runs so deep. And this ultimately is the existential problem for the EU project, I think. Because if you deny a problem's existence, then you deny the scale of the threat until it's too late.
I'm going to quote Baldwin again.
Please, always.
Yeah, I mean, some people, I think a good way of describing this podcast is people please read James Baldwin.
Yeah.
In 1981, and I have the quote that because that's the one I used in that same piece as well. He said, and he was in Amsterdam when he was saying this, we are not a minority in the world. You are a minority. That's what you cannot face. All you really have, after all, are space shuttles, banks, and weapons. Which I love this sentence.
Oh my goodness.
what you don't have anymore is me, the slave, the N-word, the black cat who believed everything you said once. I've dealt with you for a very long time. Now you've got to deal with me, and I came to stay. That's what he said. And I mean, a lot of this is James Baldwin's language. He obviously developed a reputation for talking like this in a kind of half poetic, half direct way, which is, I know is why it can be so powerful. But so I bring this up because it's never the same. 1981 is not the same as now. There was the Soviet Union back then. There was the Eastern Bloc. There was all of that. It's not the same, but there are echoes, and these echoes I feel are very interesting, very depressing sometimes, to be honest. And this whole notion that my particular background is very interesting. It's because it puts me in weird positions that, trust me, like if you get to know me very well, I'm someone who wants to be left alone. I'm someone who loves my peace and quiet. I can comfortably be with my dogs for just days on end without seeing anyone. As long as they have some contact, I'm fine. It's just a character thing. But I've been again, by coincidences, moving to the UK in 2015 and the run up to the Brexit crisis, to use the word crisis again, and then moving here. I'm in Switzerland now, near France, and France for me is this country where, for some background, I was actually born in France, but I don't have the nationality because of France's. It doesn't have droit du sol, so the right to what is it when you like basically you're born somewhere and you have the nationality, like what America has. And I bring all of this because it's just this very weird series of coincidences, where it essentially puts me in a position where I am the object of the crisis of the place where I currently am located.
Oh my goodness, yeah, I can relate to that.
Exactly. And in the UK, I mentioned this story. I mentioned this. I think I even mentioned it in the previous episode, in the Hummus For Thought one that we did. That being on the tube and seeing the old guy who's like his, I can't actually remember what he looks like. It's kind of just a monstrous personality in my mind right now. Reading this headline where it's one of those migrants are coming, they're under something that they were stuck in a lorry, they were under a bus, they were trying to reach the UK via the channel and so on, and just having this weird like kind of out of body experience. Like I was seeing myself in this headline, like this is me. Essentially, there were Syrians, as far as I can tell, in the photo. Syria and Lebanon not so long ago were the same place.
Yeah.
And it's just this weird series of coincidences. So what I'm trying to get at is these past 5 years, almost 5 years now, since leaving Lebanon to start my studies, first in the UK, then Scotland. I said the UK and that's Scotland. I think that says a bit about what I think about Scotland's independence.
And Scotland as well. Yeah.
And now in Switzerland. It really highlighted to me how much my life, and therefore my conclusion, and this is a very Baldwinian thing, the life of everyone, how much luck affects it, like how much just depends on sheer luck. It's complete. It's a complete, like I did not choose to be born in a post-war generation in Lebanon. My mom and dad obviously are the war generation, but at the same time the Syrian friends that I have met in the past few years, they are part of the quote-unquote war generation now.
Right.
And these are things that, now it puts me in a position of privilege in the context of Lebanon.
Yes.
But that could have easily not been the case had, if we were in 2006. 2006, there was the war, Israel's bombardments of Lebanon, and the Lebanese were refugees in Syria. Yeah. Because that's obviously the only border that Lebanon has. And all of this it just feels sometimes like a cosmic joke.
Yeah.
Like we are...
Oh my God, yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
We are obsessing as a general public. Some do it much more than others, mainly because the others don't have much choice in the matter. over these categories, like the European way of life, and of course the British way of life, a big topic of discussion. I remember having it on the walls of the courses I was taking at SOAS. What was it, like a list of 5 or 10 things that define Britishness or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those weird things, because you would see the list and I get the list, I understand, fine. But who is like this? Like, I've never met a single person in the UK, British or otherwise, who actually ticks these boxes. And obviously these are boxes that are exclusively reserved to migrants, obviously.
Yeah.
But yet another of those segues.
No, it's great. This is exactly as I feel. This is as I feel.
So the article, and I love the fact that they featured it in my piece. So the piece that you wrote, you cannot sing Rule Britannia to a virus.
Well, true.
I mean, it's a different context. The UK and the EU, although obviously very linked, but this whole notion of so for me, what the virus is doing. And this, I really do not want. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying this is a good thing. None of these things are good. Nothing of what I'm talking here is everything is bad. But it's one of those. Basically, the virus doesn't give a shit about borders. It doesn't care about nation states. It doesn't care about your class. It will affect you whether you want it or not. In theory, in practice, then you have other stuff, because class obviously does actually come into place. Borders do come into place depending on how early the responses were, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But the fact that you compared Angela Merkel, and this is something in her favor. I think it will be undeniable. I'm definitely to her left, but it will be just completely undeniable. It will be unreasonable to deny this. The way she speaks calmly as a scientist, and she's not trying to basically say, the very pardon me, my crass American personification, like, let's just shoot the damn thing.
Yeah.
Which is pretty much what many Republicans have been saying, without saying it in that way. But it's that.
Trump said we should bleach the damn thing. I mean, it's literally, it's close enough. Yeah.
It's close enough. Trump, Boris Johnson, even Macron himself said, on est en guerre, we are at war. This whole framing of a war, like, on the one hand, I can, in a super naive way, like very, very naive way, I thought that maybe, let's see, if they all call it a war, maybe that means that, we'll come together against this invisible enemy. Because, there's this story, and it's in literature, it's in movies. All we need to have humans together is to have some kind of alien invasion, and then we'll all come together. That's the plot of Arrival. That's the plot of many movies and so on. But, that's not how it happens. We have the politicization of... I wouldn't say politicization, because, I mean, it's all political anyway. But the cynical use of the virus, which is how we've seen Boris Johnson, how we've seen Trump, some of the others as well, use Orban, Netanyahu to even a different extreme.
Oh my goodness,
and so on. It's just, for me, it just plays this whole 5 years now, 5 years of my life, just feeling that it's all been one story.
Yes.
Where some of the characters in that book, and if it's not too narcissistic, myself included, and other people have been basically saying, guys, there's this tsunami coming. We see it. It's literally in front of us. It's right there. I can see it with my own eyes. And everyone else, or like a lot of people around you, basically calling you a monster and saying, go back to where you came from. Go back to that tsunami.
Yeah, right. Yes, yes.
Just denying reality, basically.
And so who is it? There's a Twitter account, May Saloon, on Twitter.
Yes.
Yeah. And he fled Syria, I think, with his family.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly with his partner, maybe his family as well. And he said, look, the fascism we're seeing in Syria cannot be contained by its borders.
Mm-hmm.
That has to leak out somewhere. He said, the smashing of graves, the smashing of mass graves, that has to seep somewhere out into the world. You can't contain that. Like, fascism, like virus, moves across borders. It doesn't care. It does, and it does spread. Actually, it is contagious. We see it in Orban. We see it in Putin. We see it across, Belarus. Like, countries which aren't so much on the sort of the, on the they're on your radar because you read pretty much everything under the sun, as far as I can tell. But So these things are spreading across borders, these infectious ideas. And unfortunately, the ideas that are spreading are the worrying kind, the wrong kind. And I want to come to what you said again about the cosmic joke. Look, here's the thing. Anyone that knows me might think, oh yeah, you're a massive extrovert. But anyone that really knows me knows that there is a part of me that always has craved the quiet life. And that a successive terms of my life, I've been forced into positions of being the other. And I don't enjoy it, actually. And it's something I still struggle with even now, having to be so visible, being hyper visible. And what I've realized is the only way through this is to embrace it, is to embrace hyper visibility in my public life, but in my private life to shrink away. So I've got this thing of when I see immigrants being attacked, migrants, refugees, I'm like, they're talking about me because, and if you see me on the street wearing a tracksuit, I might as well be that person you've stigmatized as a drug dealer because I don't dress differently in order to differentiate myself from, I wear flashy stuff because I like that, but I don't wear it so people look at me and go, he's definitely not one of those black people. That's not my agenda. So I'm very much like you. I feel like it's a cosmic joke where I have friends, white friends in middle class backgrounds, who I'm very close to, like my greatest friends, and I see how their lives proceed unimpeded by racism, and I think, and homophobia in my case as well, because I identify as bisexual. And I think to myself sometimes, my goodness, imagine what my life would be like if I wasn't impeded by these things. And my mum said it best. My mum called me out because she's a doctor, and she said, it was kind of a bit heartbreaking. She said, Musa, I'm a doctor, so I see so many people's lives from start to finish. I will see people live and die. I will start seeing a patient when because she's in her 70s now. There are some patients she will have known who've kind of she's grown up with, who are either slightly older than her or the same age as her. She sees them go through life, from 20 to 70, from, 15 to 65. And she'll have seen them grow up. And she says, Musa, you would not believe, in comparison to you, how many people's lives just float along smoothly without real interruption. And that was the thing that really was kind of heartbreaking, because if you're going through something, it's okay if you're going through it, people are going through their own stuff. But for my mum to be like, actually, a lot of people don't really go through that much, it brings it home to you. And someone wrote to me recently, actually, a friend from law school. He wrote to me because he read one of my football articles about a team I played for at university. And he described what his life had been like in the last 20 years. And he said, pretty uneventful, moved to the Middle East, moved back to the UK, met my wife at a friend's wedding, a mutual friend's wedding, a friend of ours we'd known from uni. Met her, had 2 kids, then had a 3rd kid. Now we live by the coast. And I'm like, and he goes, yeah, and I've looked at your life. And he's like, just from what I've seen of it, he said, the ups and downs have been painful, heartbreaking to see, because I know that you're quite sensitive. So you've been through so much, and watching you from a distance, it's been painful to see that. And I'm so glad that you've made a life yourself, made yourself happy. But that contrast right there of being the object of events, sometimes the punchline of a cosmic joke, which I felt like at times, I think it's why it enables me to write with a little bit of empathy for people suffering even more than myself, because I have the privilege of having suffered a fraction of what these people have suffered, but enough to give me an empathy for them. But also I have the privilege of a platform to amplify them. In certain spaces, not to give them a voice, they have voices, but to say, okay, here is a conversation being had that I'm aware of because of my limited degree of suffering, that I can now put into a different context. That's why my articles, I wrote a piece about the German far right and constant vigilance. I made great care to cite not only mainstream sources, but sources that were outside the mainstream, NGOs outside the mainstream, because I know that if that piece goes viral, it gets widely shared. And in 1 or 2 cases in the last 5-6 years, I can say I've had pieces like that. Then those links to those organisations at the grassroots will get an abnormal amount of traffic and visibility, which is what they deserve. And I feel that's my role as someone who benefits from this great privilege, but also who is in the kind of some level cosmic joke category, objective event category. I straddle those 2 worlds, and I'm trying to bring them together as much as I can in my work.
Yeah, I can definitely see where you're coming from, and there, for me, my equivalent in a sense, well, it's never a perfect equivalent, but the equivalent in my case is the fact that I've been following what's been happening in Syria for more or less around 2013, especially after the chemical massacre, is when my attention really started. I knew a bit before, but not as much as after.
Yeah.
For me, this story of Syria, and you mentioned it a bit before in this chat as well. It's not that I am this random Lebanese guy who only it's not just the fact that there's a humanitarian crisis going on and we need to care because we need to care. It's not just that.
Yeah.
It's also the fact that the way we, quote unquote, the global community, whatever that means, has reacted to Syria and to Syrians, especially when they started fleeing the country.
Yeah.
These are not random occurrences. It's not something like that. That's one thing that I feel some people get and some people don't get. I don't think it's necessarily a matter of being ill-meaning or most people, when I talk to them about what I will try and express here, they don't mean it badly when they basically react with a bit some confusion, or they don't actually know what I mean, because it's this disconnect between countries, between regions, between even within unions, within whatever, that for me, I feel like I didn't have the time to develop this kind of delusion, essentially. Like, it's this kind of feeling false sense of security that what is happening over there will never come here. This is something that doesn't make sense for me, because the over there was Syria and I'm from Lebanon, so the next door neighbor. But then I moved to the UK right around the same time where those people were also trying to move to Fortress Europe, more or less, within plus 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
And so the over there just became over here in my life and in quote unquote in politics. And this is something that I feel is really, really crucial in the Syrian story. It's something that Syrians have been saying from like day one, since you have some of these essays that I've been reading that say exactly what I'm saying now.
Yeah.
Were written in 2011. Like, there's nothing that much of there isn't that much of a there isn't that surprise factor in that sense. So this goes back to the point that you were making as well, that when we're saying cosmic joke here, what I'm trying to express in a more if I want to make it a bit more sophisticated, is like what Zygmunt Bauman, when he spoke about precarity and know the what is it, liquid modernity and liquid fear, especially. Liquid fear is fear of something that is abstract,
yes,
but that somehow you feel that this can affect you, like this might come to you one day,
right?
And so, for which in this story is, the migrants, the refugees, what they represent, that's what he says as well, is that these people coming to Fortress Europe, I think he said this in 2014 or 2015, they look very much like you, like the European in that case, in the sense that many of them, most of them actually just had relatively normal careers before the quote-unquote crisis hit, before the revolution and then civil war. Many are doctors. Germany is actually trying to use some of them now, as far from what I can tell.
Interesting, yeah.
Architects, teachers, anything else. You don't have to have a good quote-unquote job to be meaningful, obviously. But in the sense that they were not as othered as many of those far right and the others wanted them to be, and so they had to be othered. Like, it had to happen. It's a process that had to happen, and that happened slowly every day. These headlines, obviously in the UK, we associate them with the Sun, the Daily Mail, and so on. This dehumanization had to happen progressively, had to happen slowly. It started in Syria, in the context of the 2011 uprisings and everywhere else, but it just expanded.
Yes.
And I really, really hope, and I'll end my rambling on this, like, I really hope that I read this article on, I think it was on Foreign Policy, I think, or somewhere. I'll find it and link it.
Yeah.
That the real revenge of Syria will be a second wave of the coronavirus, something like that.
Wow.
The argument obviously is that most hospitals have been bombed, so obviously there cannot be any real responses. So what exactly is going to happen? Either the world, and it's not impossible, the world decides that we're going to cut off all of Syria, we're going to close all of its borders, which means Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq.
My God.
And we're going to do all of this, which might happen. I don't really know. Lebanon is definitely capable of doing it. Turkey as well. Turkey has done it many times, and Iraq as well. But even if they get that, Jordan as well, by the way, even if they are that extreme, will they succeed? Are we just hoping that we quote unquote the ones outside of Syria can just close them off and hope for the best, hope that it doesn't spread out beyond those borders, and damn those who are within those borders? Because even if you don't care about human beings, even if you're someone who doesn't care about Syrians, one thing that you should have learned by now, and I'm saying should because most most people who think that way won't, obviously, is that this is gonna leak, quote unquote, whether you want it or not. The way this virus, as we know, is manifesting itself. And again, this goes back to not a cosmic joke, maybe like some cosmic cruelty, honestly, that okay, well, you didn't want to pay attention to them, now you may have to. And
this is exactly right. No, these, by the way, what you said is not, I haven't interrupted, not because you were rambling, but because I was agreeing with so much of it. And I think, no, you've articulated it beautifully. And I think, unfortunately, the problem is that we have treated the world, the global community, we have treated Syrians like a virus. We've treated them and their pain and their extermination as a virus. And it's a thing we've wanted to turn away from. And the reason why I'm actually a bit harsher than you on the average person, I'm really harsh about this, because if we really care about Syria, some people, if you say to a lot of people, oh, Syria, they'll be like, I'm too far away to affect it. I'm too far away to care. Okay, then, well, how about you reflect that in your voting patterns? But no, you vote to leave the EU. You vote for closed borders. You vote for a world which is more brutal for Syrians. You don't think when you're voting, oh, actually, this is voting for a more progressive world. You think of yourself. And actually, I'm really harsh about this, Joey. I don't think most people are kind. I don't think most people are good. And I say this because I've just read a memoir by the great Oluda Equiano, who was enslaved for much of his life. And there's one passage I can never forget. It's talking about slave masters in Jamaica. And he's telling the story of how the white slave masters, it was absolutely routine for them to rape black women and to rape people, to rape women even younger than 9 years old. So this is in the 1750s, 60s, where it's already accepted that slavery is barbaric. It's already accepted that paedophilia is barbaric, that rape is barbaric, slavery. That's accepted in 1760. And the other story he tells, he says, and then he says, there's a black guy, an enslaved black guy, and all he wants to do is date a sex worker, a white woman, a sex worker in the West Indies. And God knows her story must have been extraordinary, because she was such a taboo that she was hated. She was the kind of person the white slave masters wouldn't touch. When they find out the black man and the white woman have been having a consensual sexual relationship, they tie the black man down and they pour melting hot wax all over his back. And I remember, and not just any old hot wax, but the sealing wax, the type that seals documents that get sent across, so the kind that like scars you horrifying. I don't know if the guy survived, but I read that recently, and that's why I've become a lot harsher about human nature and about what the majority accepts with apathy. There is a huge problem in Europe with apathy, and it relates to gender as well. I can tell you for a fact that when I post stuff about climate change on social media, when I post stuff about gender-related violence and about Syria on social media, I can almost predict the same 15 or 20 people that will engage with the post. Whereas if I post about cake or cats or an animal video or a piece of personal good news, I could have upwards of 100, 120, 200 likes, 300 likes. And I'm like, oh, so you people are reading all of this stuff that I post, but you refuse to engage with it. And that's why I'm actually quite harsh about the silent majority being good, because I don't think they are. I don't think we are. And that's why I'm such a believer in institutions and the rule of law. It's why, despite criticising the EU in this podcast, I still support the EU, because I don't think human beings can be trusted to respect norms, social norms like morality, without structures that also respect that morality. I think we need institution structures that incentivize compassionate behavior. I really believe that. And the reason I believe that is because I was talking to a woman from the Roma community. Shout out to Timea Younghouse. She's the chief executive of the ERIAC. It's, I think, the first ever cultural organization for Roma and academia in Europe. And she said that the dangerous thing, she said, in attacking institutions like the EU too much is actually they've done a lot despite all their problems, they have done a lot to protect the rights of Roma. These human rights organisations that can be, at the end of the day, I think that the EU has a crisis of management. I don't think it's inherently an evil organisation. I think that it has a crisis of management, and that is genuinely a crisis. And if I can do anything with my life as someone living in Europe, it's to help to strengthen those institutions so things like Syria don't happen again. The human beings aren't treated as viruses. And the heartbreaking thing for Syria, and watching that in 2011, watching it unfold, is that my mother is a refugee, my family are refugees. And seeing Syria happen again, and in the early days I was comparing Assad to Idi Amin, and I was getting a lot of followers from Syria because of the comparison I drew, and I explained why it was happening. And I said, this is the comparison. I said, God forbid the day that Assad is ever worse than Idi Amin. And he is. He's become worse. And I've had to watch it, not had to watch it, I mean, I've watched it in slow motion over 9 years from the other side of the world, watched the horror unfolding, the same stories that my mother told, that my family told. And watching it happen to Syrians again has just been, I won't say devastating because that centres my own pain in it all. It's been heartbreaking to witness. And the heartbreaking thing has been how few people around me, actually, if I'm honest, could be bothered to care. And I've said this many times on social media. I said it on Facebook. I said, listen, you don't even have to just share it. Just pass it on. Just bear witness. The least you can do is bear witness. People have refused to bear witness, Joey. Yeah. They've refused to bear witness. And that to me is the legacy of all this. We couldn't even get them to click an article, to comment on it, to care.
Yep.
Sorry to be harsh, but that's how I see it, Joey. Because ultimately, when it comes down to it, and I don't mind you jumping in there. Like, you can ultimately, it's getting people to care, and at every opportunity they've been given a chance to actually care. What have they done? They voted for, and I'm not saying they should have voted for Corbyn. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying that the polling should have been so bad, it should have spooked the Conservatives out of putting forward candidates like that. Civic engagement matters. If you're on the street and you're talking to someone and they go, would you vote Conservative? And you go, no way in hell. And they see their poll numbers dropping below zero. They see negative approval ratings because what's happening to Syria across the world is so brutal. That has an impact at a planning level. The fact that British people, as a majority, could not even be bothered to show disapproval of the UK's behaviour for the last 10 years, that is a shame. That is a historical, colonial, galactic, cosmic shame on the British people. It is a shame on them.
No, I mean, you won't see me disagreeing there at all. I was just
No, it's fine. No, I just, because don't get me wrong, just to jump in and just to conclude, and this isn't criticising you at all. It's more like
no.
We talk so much about the silent majority being benevolent. I don't think it is, actually. I don't think it is.
I admit to being undecided myself. I'm not. I never. That's maybe it's a character thing, but I never. For me personally, I never would be able to say. Even using the word silent majority, I don't know what it means. Basically, I don't know. Because as far as I could tell, most people have not been silent. They've just been arguing or yelling or being generally noisy, as opposed to silent, about other things. And those other things are, for me, say a lot. Like it says a lot that so many people were able to be duped into Brexit in the first place. Yes. And it says a lot to me that I was anti-Brexit before. I became even more anti-Brexit the day it happened, and even more anti-Brexit to this day. It just progressively moved into more and more anti-Brexit. And what I saw in the past 4 years, and I'll ask you a bit to conclude on a different note, but I'll
Yeah,
say
sure,
this.
sure.
What I've been seeing is an effort to legitimize Brexit in the case of the UK. From people who are anti-Brexit, or manifestly anyway, supposedly anyway. It's kind of, they thought that the way to have this middle ground is to accept that the center right now is Brexit, and we will find some compromise in between what we supposedly wanted and what quote-unquote they want.
Yeah.
But this simply does not take into account Cambridge Analytica. It doesn't take into account the actual lies that were said in order to make Brexit in the first place, and doesn't take into account any kind of criminality which the UK government is not even investigating anyway.
Yeah.
And so all of this to say, and this will be an awkward segue. I want you to, if that's okay, like on a kind of a closing note, to reflect a bit on what's next for you. So let's kind of end it in a simpler way. Like, what's next for you in the coming weeks, in the coming months, or what you hope to be able to do anyway. And we'll link everything that we spoke about today. Hopefully I won't forget anything, and in the description for everyone else to read. Because so I'll end on this. What I really want to try and do with these episodes, or most episodes, is just talk about something as kind of an introduction to a certain topic, often sometimes difficult, sometimes not, and then say, okay, if you want to read more about this, or watch more, listen more, podcasts, videos, whatever, I will link them on the website and on Twitter and so on, and basically then it's up to you guys. I will do the same with this, so I'll ask you to reflect a bit on what was said, I guess, now, and what's next for you.
Okay, so in terms of reflecting on what we've just said, I don't believe that the majority care. I don't believe the majority are compassionate. At the same time, I believe that there are enough compassionate, committed people at a time like this that really care, and it's those people I want to work with. It's those people I want to encourage, and those people who, those people might listen and be like, oh, you're saying most of us are passive. I think we are. I think most of us are passive to varying degrees. But my agenda, and I do have a very firm agenda, is to encourage compassion, is to encourage better knowledge, better information sharing, greater rigor and greater courage in confronting prejudices within others and within ourselves primarily, in confronting ourselves and saying, I'm not going to look away from that problem, I'm going to look at it. That is the way we get out of this mess. That's the way we confront this mess. And so by having a really rigorous critique of structural power, within the EU in my case, but also in different countries, people critiquing Bolsonaro, people critiquing Trump, Orban, to really create better networks for those people at grassroots level and elevate their voices in rooms where they're not being heard, to give them platforms where they deserve platforms. That is my agenda, and that to me ties in so much with what we've discussed. Because if you had Syrians on those nightly German talk shows from 2011 onwards, it may not have got that bad. If the moment Assad had started turning this way, you had Syrians in the EU regularly briefing people at the highest level, having platforms, speeches, not just feeding stuff in or documentation being at the center of the process, actually being given platforms where Macron said, for example, today I'm not going to address the nation, I'll let Syrians address the nation. Imagine that. If we'd had that world, and that's the world that I want for the EU, that's the world I want for the rest of the world, we'd be a much better place. And in terms of what I'm going to do in the next few months, I have various platforms. I have my Stadios Football podcast. I have my electronic music that I make with BBXO. I have my writing, my website. I have my Instagram account. I have my political commentary column at the Byline Times. I have my occasional work at The Guardian. I'm going to use each of those platforms to encourage greater vulnerability in the face of reality. And what I mean by that is, instead of hardening ourselves to difficult realities, instead of retreating within ourselves and getting outraged by convenient targets, like the American president, because I think a lot of the outrage at Trump for a lot of people, unfortunately, is a kind of empathy bypass. It's an ability to be outraged as part of a crowd, but actually, what's your strategic plan? You know who this man is. He knows who he is. You know that he's a multiple alleged rapist. You know that he's hated black people as long as he's owned property. You know all that. He hasn't changed. How have you changed? What are you changing? So my aim in the next few months is to challenge myself and to challenge others to network and work together for a better world as effectively as we possibly can. That is my agenda.
That's a really good note to end on. Thanks a lot for your time, Musa.
Thank you, my friend. It's always a pleasure. And can I say as well, before you go, I'm a huge fan of your work. Just as an editor, as a curator, as a writer of social observation, I feel there's a lot of people on social media who I would say I learn from. And there's a few I learn from among most others. I'd say you're that person in many respects. Asteris, also I think a colleague of yours at Global Voices. Shout out to him. Shout out to Jessica Horn at Still She Rises on Twitter, who is probably the greatest influence on my frame of political thinking over the last few years. So yeah, like you three are really up there. If I had to name 20 people who influenced me on Twitter, I'd say you're top 20. If not 15. So thank you so much. Yeah. I mean that. Like, and I follow like 2,500 people, but I always take a lead from what you say. You educate me, so thank you for that education.
Same goes to you. Thank you a lot, Musa.
My pleasure, man. My absolute pleasure.